How's it going today, folks? It's your boy CJ Everson, back with another one. Welcome back to the Jewish Skeptic. So, here we go again, dropping stuff. Let me get this up. Alright, so today I want to talk about how religion can implement wars. Now, before anybody get their panties in a wad, I'm not saying that religion don't do good things, because it does. I mean, people need religion. Don't get me wrong. But what about the bad stuff that it has caused? And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. So, strap on your seatbelt. It's time to go for another one. Welcome back to the Jewish Skeptic. Okay. The most dangerous sentence in human history might be this, y'all. I mean, think about it. God told us to do it. Not because every war starts with religion. I mean, I think that would be lazy if we compile that like that. That would be very lazy. I mean, think about it. Humans fight over land. They fight over power. They fight over money. They fight over revenge. They fight over identity. They fight over empires. See, humans don't need a Bible or a Quran or a Torah. Hell, they don't even need a priest, a pastor, or a rabbi to become violent. Humans are already good at that by themselves. Would you agree? But religion does something more powerful than that, if you ask me. See, religion can take human violence and give it divine permission. Religion can take human ambition and make it sound holy. I mean, religion can take conquest and call it obedience. And I'm just giving y'all some examples on what I think religion can do. Religion can take revenge and call it justice. Religion can take hatred and call it righteousness. That's the problem, if you ask me. The issue is not that religion causes every war. I think it's more of the issue is what happens when God becomes the excuse. Because once people believe God approves their violence, accountability seems to just disappear at this point. No one has to prove they're right. And I mean, no one has to prove that they're wrong neither. Well, more, I would say they wouldn't even question it if they were wrong before I would say proof. So no one has to question if they're actually wrong. No one has to look at the victims as human anymore. They're not people now in their eyes once they, get their mind set up that their God has told them to do this. Those people become their enemies. They're sinners. They're pagans to them. They're infidels. That's a word for it. Those people essentially become curse to those people. And they are standing in the way of what these people's God told him. And once you convince yourself that the person in front of you is standing against God, you can do almost anything to them and you can still sleep good at night. That is dangerous. Violence is bad enough when humans admit it's human. But violence becomes terrifying when humans drag God into it and call it holy. Now, let me be clear when I say this, because I know someone is already warming up their thumbs in the comment section. And I am not saying religion causes all violence. I am not saying that. I am not saying that religious people are uniquely violent. I'm not saying atheists or secular governments or political ideologies and nationalism, race ideology, or empires get a free pass when I'm talking about this. No, they don't get a free pass. Humans can turn almost anything, and I mean anything, into a weapon. A flag can become sacred. A nation can become sacred. A political party can become sacred. A race can become sacred. And ideology, one of my favorite words, can become sacred. So, no, religion is not the only thing humans use to justify violence. Religion has to stop acting like it has never been used that way, though. It's got to be honest. I mean, because the record is sitting right there in front of us if you pick it up. I mean, the Bible has war. The Quran has war. Religious history has war. Sacred land has war. Forced conversion has war. Crusades have war. Empires march with religious symbols. I mean, think about that. Armies killed while believing heaven approved the mission. So no, I am not making the childish argument that religion causes every war. I think I'm making a stronger argument here. Here's why. Religion becomes dangerous when it gives violence a halo. That is my point. And this is where people, they start playing games, because they'll say something like, well, that was politics, not religion. All right, cool. Fair enough. But history is not that clean. In the ancient world, religion and politics were often tied together. Kings did not just rule, they ruled with divine backing. Land was not just land, it was promised land, sacred land, blessed land, or cursed land. The army was not just an army, it was fighting under divine purpose. The law was not just the law, it was God's law. So when people say that my argument wasn't religion and it's just politics, I have to ask, in what century are you living in? Because for most of human history that I have discovered since I got on this journey, I mean, religion and politics were not standing on the opposite sides of the room. They was holding hands. And sometimes they was holding the same sword. Let's be honest. This is what makes this conversation so uncomfortable, especially when I'm discussing it online. People want religion to get credit for the soup kitchen, but not answer for the sword. They want religion to get credit for charity, but don't want to answer for conquest. They want religion to get credit for hospitals, but not answer for forced conversion. They want to say, look at all the good believers have done in God's name. But the moment someone says, all right, okay, now let's talk about the violence done in God's name. Suddenly, everyone get quiet. They ain't got nothing to say. No, don't get quiet now, Bubba. No, we ain't doing that. We're not doing that. If God gets the credit when believers do good, then religion has to face the record when believers do violence in God's name too. You don't get to claim the soup kitchen and dodge the battlefield. You don't get to claim the hospital and dodge the crusade. You don't get to claim mercy and ignore the massacre. That is just not honest. That is selective memory with a hymn playing in the background. Now, let's slow it down a little bit and let's deal with the Bible for a minute. Because this is where people really start getting nervous. It's usually in these conversations I be having, especially when you start dealing with the Bible. We can now talk about religion and war while pretending the Bible is just peace, love, and vacation Bible school snacks. The text alone contains stories where war is not just allowed, it is commanded. Entire groups are placed under divine judgment. Armies become instruments of God's will. People are destroyed because the text says God ordered it. Now, someone will say, well, you are taking it out of context. No, I ain't taking it out of context. I am reading the part you skipped during Sunday service. Because if the text says God commanded violence, then we got to deal with that. You can't just say that was man and not God when the text itself puts the command in God's mouth. That is the issue. Once violence is framed as obedience to God, the victims, they don't get a defense. Mercy becomes disobedience. Questioning becomes rebellion. And doubt becomes weakness. And cruelty becomes faithfulness. That is not morality. That is obedience with blood on it. And before someone say, well, CJ, you know, that was the Old Testament. Let's not act like Christian history gets clean hands after Jesus shows up. Don't do that now. Because Christianity starts as a persecuted movement under Rome. And then it gets to the Roman Empire. And then suddenly the cross is not just a symbol of suffering. It becomes a symbol carried into battle. And that's what happens when religion gets close to power. The language changes. Love your enemy becomes defeat God's enemy. Turn the other cheek becomes march under the holy banner. Blessed are the peacemakers becomes we need one more campaign to take back what God supposedly gave us. Funny how fast peace becomes policy when the church gets access to a military budget. And this is not just Christianity. Let me say that. That is why the thumbnail has all three Abrahamic faiths on the left side of the thumbnail. This is for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All of those religions have histories tied to sacred lands, sacred identity, divine promise, covenant, let me think, law, prophecy, and belonging shit. And when land becomes sacred, conflict becomes harder to solve, because when land is just land, I think humans can negotiate. They can draw borders, They can make stuff like treaties. They can trade. They can argue and still leave room for a deal. Now, when land becomes God's land, compromise starts looking like betrayal. Now, you ain't just arguing over dirt. You're arguing over divine promise. You're arguing over prophecy. You're arguing over covenant. You're arguing over who God supposedly chose, who God supposedly rejected, and who has the holy receipt. And that is when people and things start to get dangerous. The moment dirt becomes holy, blood becomes easier to justify. That line right there is this whole episode, bruh. The moment dirt becomes holy, blood becomes easier to justify. Now, because the person on the other side is not just your political opponent, they're standing in the way of your God's plan. And once you believe that, peace starts looking like weakness. Mercy can start looking like betrayal. Negotiation starts looking like you're compromising with the enemy, with evil. That is how religion can intensify violence, in my opinion. It doesn't always start with a fire. Sometimes it pours gasoline on the wall, or no, pours gasoline on the fire and calls the smoke sacred. Now, CJ, bring it back a little bit. Let's be fair, because I'm not here to lie for anyone's applause at all. Religion has also inspired mercy. It has also inspired charity, and it inspired peace movements that I can think of. I mean, it's also inspired people to fight bad things like slavery, and it inspired people to feed the poor and protect the vulnerable and stand against oppression even. That is true. But here is the part people usually don't want to sit with or talk about. The same religious tradition can produce a hospital in one century and a battlefield in another. The same Bible can be used by the slave and by the slave master. The same God language can comfort the suffering and justify the oppressor. So the question is not, can religion be good? Well, of course it can, y'all. I'm not saying that. The question is, what happens when religion gives people permission to stop questioning their own violence? That is the problem. Because if I say, I want your land, that sounds like greed. If I say, I want revenge, that sounds like hatred. If I say, I want power, that sounds like an empire. But if I say, God gave us this land, now greed becomes a halo. If I say, God judged these people, now hatred has a robe on it. If I say, God commanded this war, now violence has been baptized. Same violence, just better branding, bro. This is what I mean when I say God becomes the excuse. The sword was human. The ambition was human. The politics were human. The greed was human. The revenge was human. The tribalism was human. But the excuse was divine. And once you make the excuse divine, you make the crime harder to question. Because now anyone who challenges the violence is not just challenging a person. They are supposedly challenging God. That is how accountability dies. Not all at once. Slowly. First, you make the enemy seem less human. Then you make the mission more holy. Then you make doubt look sinful. Then you make mercy look weak. Then you make obedience more important than coincidence. You know what? That's really the wrong word. I'd say conscience. It becomes it makes obedience more important than conscience. And before long, people are standing in the ashes and they'll say something like, God told us to do it. This is why this matters, because history is full of people doing human things while hiding behind divine language. Conquest, slavery, forced conversion, holy war, religious persecution, ethnic cleansing, empire, colonization. And every time someone somewhere found a way to put God's signature on the paperwork. Every time. That is the part I cannot ignore. People keep asking, does religion cause violence? I think the question is too small, actually. I think the better question is, what happens when violence gets divine permission? What happens when humans stop saying, I want this, and they start saying, God wants this? What happens when revenge gets called justice? What happens when conquest gets called obedience? What happens when land gets called holy? What happens when the enemy gets called evil? What happens when people no longer need evidence because they believe heaven agrees with them? That is when God becomes their excuse. And when God becomes the excuse, people can do terrible things without feeling like terrible people. And I'm sorry, that is just the nuclear truth. That is the whole shebang of this episode. Religion does not have to cause every war to be dangerous. Sometimes all it has to do is bless the war after humans already chose it. Sometimes all it has to do is make the sword feel righteous. Sometimes all it has to do is tell the soldier, the king, or that priest, or the nation, or even a mob, you are not wrong, you are chosen. And once people believe they are chosen, they can stop listening to the people they are destroying. So nah, homie, this episode is not about blaming every war on religion. This episode is about exposing the excuse. Because humans started the fire. Then they dragged God into the smoke and called it holy. Once again, I'm CJ Everson. Thanks for watching The Jewish Skeptic. See y'all on the next one. Oh, no fear, no dogma, just clarity. Now I'm out for real this time, y'all. See y'all later. Peace.
Do you know what I found? The more you know, the less you know.